Hello, everybody. We've got Merrin here, who you may remember from PyCon last year as being the speaker of the flip-flop operator talk. Everybody, please welcome Merrin Macleod.
Hi, so I'm talking about environment variables. There's going to be no shell scripting in this talk. This is a talk about climate change. I'm sorry if anyone is expecting shell scripting. So there are a lot of different ways in which we affect the environment with the way that we live and the work that we do. Today, I'm going to be focusing on one particular issue, which you might know as global warming or climate change. This talk was inspired by the IPCC's 1.5 degree report, which I do recommend reading. The world is getting warmer. Many of you will have seen this graph or something like it. Each bar is a country. If it's blue, the year in the middle was colder than average, and if it's red, it was hotter than average. Australia is up there in the top left somewhere. There's always been variation in the weather. There's been hot years and there's been cold years. There's been hot days and cold days. But the cold years have been getting warmer and less frequent, and the hot years have been getting warmer and more frequent. The world's just had its hottest June on record. Australia saw its hottest January on record in the last summer, and records were broken across the country. It's because of human activity. It's getting warmer because of people and the things that we are doing. The increase in temperature is mostly because of greenhouse gas emissions. The sun has been pretty chilled out over the last 100 years. It doesn't match volcanic activity, and it's not related to the Earth's orbit. And it's bad. There are lots of different impacts from climate change with different levels of probability and risk. Things that are happening now and things that are definitely going to happen no matter what we do, and things that we can avoid. Sea level rise will cause displacement from low-lying areas, and we're already seeing things like insurance retreat and words like sunny day flooding starting to enter the vocabulary of people in areas like Florida. Rapid temperature changes will upend natural ecosystems, and we're seeing things like coral bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef. And some places where people have lived for a long time will become unlivable. We've missed the window to avoid these outcomes altogether. They're happening, they're going to keep happening, but we can do something about it. We can keep a lid on it, and we can avoid some of those outcomes if we make drastic changes quickly. These are facts, but I'll acknowledge that some people aren't convinced. It's probably fewer people than you think. In 2014, CSIRO did a survey that found Australians on average overestimate how many people don't believe in climate change by so it's actually about 8%, and on average, Australians guessed about 23%. But I'm not here to convince that minority. I'm here to talk about what we can do about it. I'm working on the assumption that everyone listening to this talk is smart and thoughtful and cares about the world. So what I am going to talk about is how our industry contributes to climate change, both positively and negatively. And I'm going to talk about how we, in our roles as software developers or tech people or the other roles that people in this room have, how we can do something about this. I'm not going to talk much about the changes that you can make in your private life. There are other places that you can go to find out about those. So first of all, how does our industry, information technology, contribute to this? IT causes about 2% of the world's emissions. This is a total made up of data centers, voice and data network infrastructure, and running devices, so end user devices. These numbers are measured in gigatons, which are millions of tons. I'm mostly going to talk about emissions from data centers today, but our work also has impact on the usage of the data transfer infrastructure and on end user devices. Data center emissions have been growing significantly every year, but the capacity of those data centers has been growing quite a lot faster because the industry has been moving towards hyperscale data centers, so moving towards the cloud. I don't know how many of you were here for Oren's talk yesterday, but woo, the cloud. Thank you. But you know, these cloud computing centers, which is just basically enormous data centers using enormous amounts of electricity, but using it more efficiently in general because they're incentivized to improve that efficiency. So these numbers, these gigatons, that's enormous. It's really hard to imagine a gigaton, or hard to imagine, you know, a third of a gigaton. How do the decisions that we make, that people in this room make, contribute to that? So first of all, I'll give you a couple of reference points for how greenhouse gases are emitted. Each kilowatt hour that you use from the grid in Sydney emits about 700 grams of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This changes depending on the particular generation mix. So if you're in Victoria, you might be importing hydro from Tasmania, or you might be importing wind electricity from South Australia. In New South Wales, you're really probably just importing coal from Queensland. So it's pretty solid, around 700 grams. When you drive 1 kilometre, depending on the type of car that you're in, you'll emit about 500 grams. And I'm assuming a well-maintained mid-range car here. And most of us don't work directly with cheese, but I'm going to use it to visualise some of these emissions. Making a kilo of hard cheese results in the emissions of about 10 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent. That's mostly methane emitted by cows. Methane is a much more effective greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, although it breaks down in the atmosphere after about 20 years. I'd like to highlight that Australia's carbon intensity for electricity, and in particular New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria, it's unusually high, particularly on the east coast because of its reliance on coal. New Zealand averages at about 120 grams, California about 250, France about 54. Queensland often gets up closer to 800. So given that, I'm going to go through a few examples of things that we do in our work that result in emissions. First of all, have a guess at how much a big grunty desktop machine drawing 1 kilowatt would emit in 24 hours if it was plugged in Sydney. Those of you who took notes in the previous slide may have done the maths. It's 16.8 kilos, so that's the equivalent of 1.68 kilograms of cheese, or about driving from here to Parramatta and back. Many of us use MacBook Pros. I've got one here. And Apple has put out an estimate of the carbon cost for each of these machines, including an estimate of its use for 4 years. Have a guess at what that might be. Think of a number in your head, sort of a volume of cheese. It's about 450 kilograms. So that's the equivalent of driving from here to Melbourne. So that's a fair bit. Like that's you know, the equivalent of 45 kilos of cheese, which is, you know, a lot. But over 4 or 5 years, you know, that's not as much as not too much. Many of us travel between cities as part of our work, whether that's for sales or to get to events like this. Flying return between Sydney and Melbourne, according to Qantas's estimate, emits about 148 kilograms of carbon dioxide. How much do you think one Bitcoin transaction emits on average? So that's me sending you a Bitcoin, or buying a pizza, or buying passwords off the dark web, whatever it is that people do with Bitcoin. And I'm just going to note that this is I know how Bitcoin works. This doesn't scale exactly per transaction, but this is really just an average thing. But on average, it's about 302 kilograms of carbon dioxide at the moment. If you're thinking that seems obscene, you're not wrong. And this scales with how many computers are on the network. Because of the algorithm that Bitcoin uses, proof of work. So any proof of work cryptocurrency has the same problem where all of the computers on the network are basically shouting number wang at each other. They're all just kind of, and using a lot of electricity as they do that. So any proof of work cryptocurrency has the same problem, but smaller networks emit significantly less. How much do you think the net emissions for a Google Cloud platform for a year are? You might have read the asterisk there and guessed, but they offset their emissions. So we'll talk a little bit about offsetting later. And how about an AWS box for a year? It's about 1.5 tons of having an AWS box in Sydney for a year. Amazon doesn't release these numbers, so I'll stress that these calculations that I've made, I've bugged all sorts of AWS people, so if you know better numbers than I do, please come up to me later. But this, as far as I can tell, this is the best guess. But remember that Australia has some of the dirtiest electricity in the developed world, so most other regions will have lower emissions. How much does training a neural network cost in carbon emissions? Well, you know, how long is a piece of string? There was a great paper put out recently called Energy and Policy Considerations for Deep Learning in NLP, Natural Language Processing, where they looked at a number of different neural networks and how much they cost in carbon emissions based off the amount of computing power that they required. The highest one, so the most intensive one that they looked at was this neural architecture search. I can't say I know exactly how that works. There's probably people in the room who do. But that came up with 284 tons of carbon dioxide emissions. And that was assuming the average emissions intensity of US electricity. So if you did this in Australia, it would be quite a bit higher. It's a lot of cheese. Still going. So I don't know about you, but that's I haven't eaten that much cheese today. So there are all these ways in which the things that we do contribute to the problem. But how can we contribute to the solution? How can we contribute to addressing climate change with our sweet computer skills that we all have? Sometimes the work that we do, even though it causes emissions, also enables reductions in emissions in other places. Software often results in more efficient uses of resources. Tech is an important part of adaptation to a low carbon economy. The work that we do reduces paper waste, and it reduces the need for travel and physically sending information from one place to another. You can use your tech skills to help society to adapt to the needs that we're going to have over the rest of the century. And there's a good chance that the work you do already does this. Things like modernising electricity grids so that they can deal with renewables better. Using energy more efficiently, so things like smart buildings and Internet of Things stuff. And transport is one of the biggest causes of greenhouse gas emissions, and there are a number of ways in which software can help this sector improve. We can improve the efficiency of personal transport, and we can improve the efficiency of logistics. Telepresence tools are also a significant way that we can help other industries reduce their impact through software. We can help them reduce transport emissions, in particular aviation emissions. Creating tools that allow people to have meaningful discussions and connections over the internet means that people don't have to fly. Things like online conferences can save massive amounts of emissions. And we can also mitigate the emissions that we produce. We can mitigate the emissions that our companies and our industry produces. There are 3 things involved with this: reporting, reducing, and offsetting. And I'll talk about each of these. The first step to reducing emissions is to count them and report them. If any of you have tried to improve speed or reduce the number of errors in your applications, you'll know that you can't improve what you don't measure. We don't tend to have a good gut feel for carbon emissions. How could we? It's literally invisible, and it often these emissions often happen in parts of the supply chain that we may not even know about. You may not realize what the biggest contributors to your emissions are, and if you don't count it, you might end up spending a lot of effort trying to optimize something that doesn't actually contribute that much, while ignoring significant contributors. The standard protocol for reporting your company's greenhouse gas emissions is called the GHG protocol. This separates emissions into 3 categories. Scope 1 is for direct emissions, so usually that's company cars will be the biggest one there, but if you're burning coal directly for some reason, or if you've got gas heating or gas ovens, that's where that goes in Scope 1. Scope 2 is emissions from electricity usage, and in Australia this is likely to be quite high. This will tend to be a significant part of your emissions. And Scope 3 is for other indirect emissions. And there's a lot of discretion around what to count in Scope 3. It's described as things that are caused by your activity, but not directly owned or controlled by your organisation. And when you think about something that we've caused, it can be hard to figure out, well, where do we stop? The official guidance is to include anything that's likely to be large compared to the rest of your emissions. So for example, IKEA decided to count customer journeys as part of their carbon footprint so that they could incentivize the people making decisions about where to place IKEA or making decisions about their business structure to reduce those emissions from their customer journeys. I would recommend putting, generally you'll always put business travel in this one, so this is things like plane trips. You might put employee commuting in there, and I would suggest putting cloud hosting and crypto transactions in there if you've got those in as part of your business. So that's all very well if you can do it, if you can influence the policy of your organisation, but not all of us have the buy-in to make our organisations go through these protocols. So here's a couple of ways to start small. Count whatever you can. Find data, make data, sneak estimated CO2 emissions into your everyday metrics in whatever way that you can, and communicate to the rest of your culture, the organisation culture and the industry culture, that this is something that you care about and that the rest of the organisation should also care about. If you don't have any data, you can start putting it together. You could survey your team or start making spreadsheets or downloading things off the internet and putting things together. So once you know what the most significant parts of your organisation's carbon footprint are, you can work on reducing them. And there's some ways to reduce emissions that aren't specific to IT organisations. These are going to be the same regardless of where you are. It's reasonably likely that your biggest contribution is air travel. You don't have to cut this out altogether, but if you're flying to the same city more than once a month or so, consider taking fewer, longer trips. Use electricity smarter in your office. Set timers or motion sensors on your air conditioning and lighting. Use more efficient appliances. And think about the carbon cost of commuting. So if people can work from home some of the time, that might help. There are also some specific things that we can do in IT to reduce our emissions. First of all, using low carbon hosting. So Google offsets and reports their emissions, so using them is probably one of your best options. If you're on AWS, their environmental credentials aren't as good, but they do have 5 zones where they use 100% renewable energy. I'll get a little bit more into the market dynamics of that later. So with Australian customers, you'll want to use the Sydney zone for anything customer facing, and that's the really high carbon zone. But can you use carbon neutral zones like the US West one or the EU ones for some of your background tasks, some of your more compute intensive but latency insensitive tasks? You can also reduce emissions by computing more efficiently, but this really isn't enough on its own. Often finding a way to do something more efficiently means that we end up just doing more of it and end up with the same results because capitalism. And finally, I'll remind you that proof of work cryptocurrency like Bitcoin works by wasting electricity. That is how it works. And the higher its value, the more electricity is wasted. So if you accept or use Bitcoin, stopping that is probably the best thing you can do for the environment. Don't at me. No, you can if you want, sorry. Just be nice. All right, anyway. So offsetting. Even after you've done your very best to reduce emissions, you're still likely to have some emissions that you can't avoid. You can offset those by basically buying shares in projects that prevent, reduce, or remove carbon. And there's a number of different ones around, and some they have varying quality. So you do have to kind of pick which offset provider to use. There's a couple of things to consider when you do this. Permanence, consider whether it's lasting. So your carbon emissions into the atmosphere last for a really long time. If you buy shares in a plantation forest that's going to be cut down for paper in 20 years, you're not really offsetting the effect of your emissions. Consider whether it's actually doing something extra. Would this thing have happened anyway? And consider leakage. Would protection of one area lead to deforestation somewhere else? Stripe has written up a really great piece about how they chose their offsets. They ended up buying offsets from a landfill methane flaring project. Again, not all of us can do this officially with our organisations, but we can do it undercover. So the number one way that you can, and probably really the only way, is to buy an offset when you book flights. So Qantas offers this and Air New Zealand offers this. I'm not sure if any other Australian airlines do, but it's not particularly expensive. It adds about $2 to a return trip between Sydney and Melbourne on Qantas. I offset my flights between here and Wellington for about $10. You could grow an office tree. The permanence is questionable, but it's nice to have a tree. So in order to incentivize other businesses to do better by our environment and our future, we should be preferring providers with better environmental practices. We can also impact the cultures of the providers that we leave, that we move away from, by telling them that this is something that we care about. Cloud hosting is likely to be the biggest contributor of the providers that you use, depending on what you're doing. So Google and Microsoft both report and offset all of their emissions. AWS does neither, and I'd like to point out that they're actually quite hostile in a number of ways to reporting their environmental, their emissions. So there's a number of ways in which they are trying, but they're not reporting properly. All of them have said that they want to get to 100% renewable energy. And they do this by making purchase agreements with renewable generators. The problem is that they're not always in the same place as where they use the electricity. So this is from Google's environment report. And you'll notice, so I live in New Zealand, and I'm used to maps without New Zealand. But you might notice this doesn't even have Australia. It doesn't have most of China, and it doesn't have quite a lot of Russia. Like there's quite a lot of the world missing from this map in places where they do use electricity. So given that, there's a lot left to be desired by their 100% renewable energy statement. So basically what they're doing is they're using 8 terawatt hours of electricity, and they're making purchase agreements for 8 terawatt hours of electricity and retiring the certificates involved with those. And I'm not sure what the market effect of that is, but it doesn't necessarily mean that, that they're not putting money into renewable projects in Australia, as far as I can tell. Again, if you know better, I've hassled all the people I can, but come and find me if you know more about that. So these market mechanisms do exist in Australia, where you can make PPAs and you get LGCs and retire them in the same way that you do in the US and the EU. There's nothing stopping these companies from doing it. It's just that the market doesn't demand it and the regulation doesn't demand it. So bug your salespeople, like get Australia on this map is what I'd like you all to do, please. So the only way that we're going to make these changes in our industry and in our communities and in your workplaces is by talking to people. Talk to people about climate change. Talk about your carbon emissions. Talk to your colleagues. Talk to your boss, your clients, your vendors. Talk to people about it when you go out for dinner tonight and at the development sprints tomorrow and when you go back to work. Treat it as a normal, straightforward part of life and business, not as a political hot potato. It should be as easy to talk about reducing reliance on fossil fuels as it is to talk about reducing reliance on Python 2. And be public about it. Share your emissions data. Declare a climate emergency. Use your social capital to pressure other people into acting on this. There are a number of groups of tech people who want to use their skills to address climate change. Climatechange.tech is a really friendly Slack group. There's this climate fixathon thing happening over the rest of the month, and there's a number of other groups that you can join. So some of you might now, and might have already been feeling the crushing weight of climate change sadness. This is a sadness that I know well. I thought that spending time researching this talk would intensify that sadness, but I'm actually feeling more optimistic about the problem than I did when I started. I'll tell you why, and maybe it'll help you feel more optimistic as well. Climate change is leading to irreversible damage. We're going to have to make massive changes. But if we do make those changes, if we mitigate our emissions and adapt our lifestyles, we'll deal with it. The world will look really different in 100 years, but it looked really different 100 years ago as well. We're contributing to these problems, but we can contribute to solutions as well. You can use your voice to make the cultural changes that we need to make. And you can use your skills to make the technological changes we need to make. We can reduce our emissions and build things to help other people reduce their emissions and adapt to a changing world. People in Australia often excuse this country's terrible climate change policy with the relative size of its emissions. It doesn't matter what we do when other people emit so much more. We don't have to settle for not being the absolute worst. We shouldn't excuse ourselves because of our size. When we're small, we can try things out, see what works, model it for others. In tech, we can model for other industries how to be conscious about our impact. Thank you very much. I've got some resources and references up online, and find me later if you want to chat about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Merrin, for a very impactful talk.